On March 20th, 1995, during the morning rush hour in Tokyo, members of Aum Shinrikyo released sarin gas on 5 subway trains. 13 people died. More than 6,000 were injured. It was not an accident, not a spontaneous act of violence. It was the final stage of a system that had been forming for years. A system built quietly, methodically. At first, Aum Shinrikyo did not present itself as a threat. It offered spiritual awakening in a restless modern world. It promised enlightenment through discipline, purity through science, a path beyond suffering. Many who joined were educated. Searching, they believed they were stepping into clarity. But over time, belief hardened into obedience, and obedience became something else. At the beginning, nothing about Aum Shinrikyo felt extreme. It felt enlightened. In the spring of 1995, Japan learned something it didn't want to know: that a modern city can be hurt not by chaos, but by planning, not by desperation, but by conviction. And when people tried to explain how it happened, the first explanations were predictable. They looked for monsters. They looked for madness. They looked for the kind of evil you can spot from a distance. But the unsettling truth was quieter. Because before anything became publicly unthinkable, Aum Shinrikyo felt to many people like the opposite of danger. It felt clean, organized, almost soothing. There was a schedule, rules, a vocabulary that promised clarity in a noisy world. People spoke carefully, as if precision itself were a kind of moral discipline. Questions were not forbidden. They were redirected. Doubt wasn't punished. It was reframed as a stage, a temporary misalignment, something that would pass. And if you were the kind of person who disliked vague answers, if you had spent years learning how systems work, how mechanisms fit together, this place didn't ask you to stop thinking. It invited you to think harder. Your education mattered here. Your discipline mattered. Your capacity for abstraction, your ability to tolerate complexity was treated like evidence. As if your intelligence wasn't just a trait. It was a sign that you belonged. And what made Aum particularly difficult to classify was that it didn't reject science, it absorbed it. Charts and scripture coexisted. Laboratories sat comfortably beside meditation halls. The message wasn't shouted, it was constant. Truth is most powerful when it is unified. From the inside, this felt like safety. Outside the gates, the world seemed fragmented, distracted, morally compromised. Inside, everything connected. Even suffering was given structure, especially suffering. And language did most of the work. Obedience became alignment. Sacrifice became optimization. Hierarchy became efficiency. Each term reduced resistance not by hiding what was happening, but by making submission feel voluntary, even intelligent. And slowly the cost of leaving increased. Not through threats, through meaning. You had invested time, intellect, identity. To walk away wouldn't simply mean you disagreed. It would mean admitting your clarity was borrowed. At some point you noticed something shift, not dramatically, just enough to register, and then fade. Trust replaces evaluation. You stop checking premises because the conclusions feel right. And the system doesn't ask you to abandon reason, it asks you to relocate it, to move it somewhere safer, somewhere it can't interrupt what comes next. Because the story of Aum Shinrikyo isn't only a story about belief. It's a story about how belief can borrow the tools of modernity and begin to sound like competence. And once it sounds like competence, people stop asking whether it should exist. They start asking how well it's being run, so we have to rewind. Back to the part that doesn't feel extreme. Back to the part that feels rational. Because that is where the real danger begins. Not in the moment of public consequence, but in the early quiet moments when everything still feels like a choice. Control did not arrive as a command. It arrived as a grammar, not a single order you could point to, more like a language that made certain thoughts easier and other thoughts harder. Aum's power didn't depend on secrecy. It depended on coherence, a kind of internal logic that reduced friction between belief and action. From the outside, it could look like a cult. From the inside, it felt like a system, and systems have a particular kind of seduction. They promise that if you understand the structure, you won't have to carry the uncertainty. The first mechanism was simple: vocabulary. Words were engineered to collapse moral distance. Scientific terminology fused with spiritual framing until technical competence became a kind of virtue. Experiments were training. Chemical processes became purification. Endurance became optimization. Each substitution mattered because it allowed members to operate inside familiar intellectual structures, while the meaning of those structures quietly shifted. This is the thing euphemism usually does. But in Aum, it went further than softening the edges. It reorganized reality. Once a term carried spiritual weight, questioning it didn't feel like skepticism, it felt like immaturity. A former member later described being told, calmly, "Your doubt means your mind is still divided." It wasn't an insult, it was a diagnosis, and if doubt is a symptom, then the cure is obvious. More immersion, more alignment, more of the system. Incentives reinforce this language. Advancement wasn't based on wealth or ordinary status, it was based on perceived refinement. Proximity to leadership meant something, not politically, spiritually, and technical skill, especially in engineering and chemistry, carried an unusual kind of prestige, not because it was practical, but because it served as proof that enlightenment and intelligence were converging inside the group. This mattered, especially for educated recruits, because many highly educated people carry a private fear that intelligence isolates. That understanding too much makes you alone. Inside Aum, intellect wasn't isolating, it was validating. Your ability to grasp complex systems didn't distance you from others. It elevated you. It made you feel chosen. And under that model, obedience didn't feel like submission. It felt like competence. You weren't being controlled. You were becoming efficient. Fear entered later. And even then, it wasn't terror. It was contamination. The outside world wasn't described as evil, it was described as noisy, mentally polluting, epistemically unstable. The threat wasn't punishment, it was regression. To question too much was to risk stagnation. To hesitate was to fall behind. Fear worked here by reframing independence as vulnerability, Autonomy wasn't strength, it was exposure. Safety came from synchronization with the group's logic, and once safety is defined that way, isolation begins to look reasonable. Communal living and intense schedules were described as efficiency measures. Minimize distraction, maximize progress. Over time, alternative reference points thinned out. Family members who expressed concern weren't necessarily attacked. They were pitied. They didn't have the framework. From the inside, this looked compassionate. From the outside, it functioned as containment. Isolation didn't remove information, it filtered interpretation. External criticism could be allowed, but only after translation, only after it was rephrased in the group's vocabulary, where it inevitably confirmed the group's worldview. And then there was authority. Centralized, yes, but not crude. Shoko Asahara's power didn't rely on constant visibility, it relied on interpretive control. He positioned himself not as a commander, but as a censor, someone who could perceive layers of reality others couldn't access yet. Orders were often delivered without explanation. When clarification was requested, the response was consistent. Understanding will arrive later. Delayed comprehension wasn't a flaw. It was framed as spiritual development. One member described being given a task that conflicted with his training. When he hesitated, the reply was brief. Execute first, insight follows. The phrasing matters. It reverses the usual sequence. Normally, understanding comes first, then action. But in this system, action precedes understanding. And once you accept that reversal even a few times, something changes in you. Responsibility begins to move, not outward, upward. If an action feels wrong, that discomfort is reinterpreted as incomplete perception. Your conscience isn't silenced, it's outsourced. And that produces a kind of relief, because moral ambiguity is exhausting. Aum offered a way to bypass it without feeling immoral. You weren't wrong, you were provisional, not unethical, just not ready to see. And when a person believes that, the system doesn't need to coerce them every day. They begin to rehearse control on themselves, quietly, automatically. Until one day, the question isn't should this be done? It's only, how precisely should it be done? There's a moment in systems like this when reinforcement becomes unnecessary, because the system is no longer outside you. It's inside your sequencing. The point of no return isn't a dramatic decision, it's a subtle reorder. Ethics, which once came before action, are repositioned to follow it. First you act, then you interpret. Meaning becomes something applied afterward, like a solvent that dissolves discomfort, and language makes this reversal feel natural. By this stage, euphemism is hardened into procedure. Actions aren't debated in moral terms anymore. They're discussed as processes, protocols, adjustments. Harm, when it registers at all, appears as a technical inefficiency, not a human outcome. From the inside, it feels professional. From the outside, it looks like dissociation. A former member recalled receiving written instructions that contained no justification, only steps. When he asked why, the response was calm. You will understand later. That phrase doesn't erase doubt, it postpones it. And postponed doubt, repeated often enough, becomes irrelevant. Incentives evolve at this stage. Earlier, alignment and devotion were rewarded. Now, speed is rewarded, compliance without friction. Those who pause to reflect aren't always punished. They're simply bypassed. The system moves around them, and momentum becomes its own proof. If things are moving forward, resistance begins to feel obstructive, not ethical. And loyalty shifts almost without announcement. It's no longer measured by belief, it's measured by responsiveness. How quickly you execute, how little you interrupt. Fear also changes character. Earlier, fear is about contamination or falling behind. Now it becomes existential, because leaving would mean more than losing community. It would mean confronting your accumulated actions. Without the framework that justified them, exit becomes narrative collapse. This is a threshold many people underestimate. To step away would require reinterpreting your past, not as disciplined participation, but as misjudgment. The mind resists that recalibration with remarkable force. Staying becomes the path of least cognitive pain, and isolation deepens, invisibly. You might still interact with the outside world, but only instrumentally. External voices are no longer engaged as correctives. They're treated as data points, something to manage. The emotional bandwidth required for genuine dialogue has already been consumed internally. From the inside, this feels like focus. From the outside, it looks like detachment. Authority now no longer needs to present itself as authority. It starts to feel like inevitability. Decisions arrive framed as outcomes of processes too complex for individual evaluation. Responsibility dissolves into systems language. One former follower described a realization that came too late. No one ever said, do this because I command it. They said, this is necessary. Necessity is more compelling than command, because command implies alternatives. Necessity implies there are none, and internal justification completes the lock. Hesitation becomes evidence of ego. Discomfort becomes a symptom. The correct response to unease is deeper immersion. Cognitive contrast is sharp here. From the inside, surrendering judgment feels like humility. From the outside, it is the final abdication of agency. What feels like trust functions like self-erasure. The point of no return is reached when imagining refusal feels more dangerous than compliance. Not because of external consequences, but because refusal would require rebuilding your world from scratch. New premises, new moral math, new language. By then, the system no longer needs to persuade. It only needs to continue. And those inside continue, not because they're unaware, but because awareness, unbuffered by structure, has become the most threatening state of all. And outside the movement, a different system is also making choices, quietly, reasonably, one small deferral at a time. The failure wasn't ignorance, it was misclassification. Aum Shinrikyo didn't evade scrutiny by hiding. It evaded scrutiny by fitting into categories that institutions weren't prepared to interrogate. Religious, intellectual, eccentric, but not strategic. And that distinction mattered. Language shaped the official response early. Reports described the group with words like unorthodox, mystical, non-conventional. These are not words that trigger urgency. They soften it. They place the group in a conceptual waiting room reserved for social oddities, not for developing threats. From inside Aum, this external labeling could feel like confirmation, a sign that ordinary society simply couldn't perceive what was happening. From outside, it functioned as dismissal. and bureaucratic incentives quietly reinforced that dismissal. Investigating a religious organization carries risk. Legal risk, cultural risk, reputational risk. Act too early and you can be accused of persecution. Act too late and you can rationalize it as prudence. The safest professional choice is often delay. That creates a bias, not toward action, toward inaction that looks responsible. Fear played a role here too, but not the fear most people imagine. It wasn't fear of harm. It was fear of misjudgment. Post-war Japan carried a strong sensitivity to freedom of belief. Authorities were cautious about appearing hostile to religious expression, especially movements that attracted educated followers and operated in legal gray zones. Intervention required certainty. Certainty was continually deferred, and information was fragmented. Pieces of intelligence existed across agencies, unusual facilities, complaints, purchases, odd patterns that seemed almost explainable. In isolation, each data point looked insufficient. Together, they suggested something else entirely. But institutions are built to respond to clear categories. A coherent threat model requires integration. And integration is hard when the system is designed to be cautious, so nothing seems definitive. And inside Aum, that lack of intervention becomes meaningful. If the state isn't stopping us, maybe the state has assessed us. Maybe it has decided we are acceptable. Or maybe it simply isn't listening for the right signals. Expertise complicated perception further. Aum employed scientists, engineers, medical professionals. Credentials signaled legitimacy, and legitimacy is often misread as stability. There's a quiet assumption in many modern societies that highly educated people are less likely to pursue irrational ends, that intelligence correlates with restraint. But intelligence can do something else. It can accelerate belief if belief is structured to reward it. Technical competence doesn't automatically resist capture. Sometimes it optimizes it. And internal justification inside oversight bodies began to mirror justification inside the movement, in a different register. Officials told themselves they were respecting civil liberties, following procedure, avoiding overreach. Each rationale was defensible on its own. Together they produced paralysis. From inside the state, restraint felt responsible. From outside, it can look like permission. And importantly, there wasn't one missed moment. There were many small deferrals, each one reasonable, each one narrowing the remaining margin for correction. The system didn't fail loudly, it failed quietly. By the time concern hardened into alarm, the window for prevention had already narrowed. Belief had become capability, rhetoric had become logistics, and institutions designed to respond to visible threats struggled to adapt to danger that advanced behind legality and a facade of spiritual purpose. What's unsettling isn't only that authorities were misled, it's that they were attentive in ways their frameworks made ineffective. They were listening, just not for the right kind of coherence. And inside the group, the cost was becoming personal. Not all at once, but steadily, in ways that could still be described by those living through it as progress. The human cost didn't announce itself as damage. It arrived disguised as development. By the time consequences became visible, many members had already learned a new habit: to reinterpret suffering as function. Pain wasn't evidence of harm. It was proof of transformation. Discomfort wasn't a warning. It was a sign something was being purified, corrected, optimized. Language decided the direction of experience. Physical exhaustion became discipline. Psychological distress became ego resistance. Fear became residue to dissolve. When words change their moral meaning, the body follows. From the inside, this could feel meaningful. From the outside, it resembles erasure. Members learn to narrate their own strain using approved vocabulary. To say "this hurts" was to confess immaturity. The correct statement was subtler. "This is difficult, therefore it matters." Once suffering acquired explanatory value, it became self-sustaining. A former follower recalled collapsing during training. No one responded with alarm. He was told softly, "If it hurts, it must be working." The phrase doesn't deny pain, it absorbs it. Incentives reinforced endurance over well-being. Those who tolerated more, less sleep, harsher schedules, deeper compliance, were praised. Resilience became currency. Vulnerability became inefficiency. And this wasn't maintained through constant surveillance. That's the part people often miss. The system trained members to monitor themselves. Self-critique replaced external discipline. You didn't need to be watched once you had internalized the metric. Fear shifted inward. Earlier fears were about exclusion or regression. Now fear became self-distrust. If you felt alarm, your perception must be flawed. If you felt empathy, attachment must be interfering. The most dangerous state wasn't doubt about the system, it was doubt about yourself. This inversion hollows out judgment. People stop asking whether something is wrong. They start asking whether they are wrong for noticing. Isolation reaches its most intimate stage here. Emotional ties outside the group aren't always attacked directly, they're deprioritized. Family concerns become distractions. Affection becomes noise. From the inside, this feels like commitment. From the outside, it looks like abandonment. Not only of others, but of one's own emotional reflexes. Authority no longer needs to issue explicit harmful commands. The system has trained its members to anticipate authority. Needs are inferred. Compliance becomes anticipatory, not reactive. One defector later described a delayed realization. No one had to force me, I was already doing it. That realization carries a particular weight. Because it isn't an accusation from outside, it's an internal accounting. An internal justification seals the cost. People retroactively explain what they've lost: health, relationships, identity, as necessary investments. To acknowledge harm would be to invalidate years of sacrifice. The mind prefers continuity to correction. From inside, endurance feels like virtue. From outside, it registers as depletion. And the cost isn't only measured in public outcomes, it's measured in attrition. The slow thinning of agency. The gradual outsourcing of empathy. The quiet replacement of lived experience with approved interpretation. By the time some members exited, they didn't always describe themselves as victims. They described themselves as empty, uncertain how to feel without permission, how to evaluate without a framework, how to suffer without meaning. The system didn't simply take something from them. It taught them how to explain why losing it was necessary. And when the case finally ended, when the public story reached its visible climax, the temptation was to treat it as sealed, contained, over. But the mechanism doesn't need the same faces, it only needs the same conditions, which is why the story doesn't really end here. It echoes, quietly, in places that don't look like a cult at all. When cases like this reach public closure, people want clean boundaries. Leaders removed, structures dismantled, risks neutralized. Closure is comforting. It implies containment. But mechanisms don't require the same actors to persist. They require the same conditions. What Aum Shinrikyo exposed wasn't only an extreme outlier, it was a repeatable pattern. The convergence of certainty, structure, and moral outsourcing. And what's most unsettling is that it didn't rely at its core on obvious cruelty. It relied on coherence. It functioned because it reduced complexity at the precise moment complexity became intolerable. From inside, it felt stabilizing. From outside, it was compressive. What was experienced as unity functioned as narrowing range. What felt like relief operated as surrender. And these dynamics scale. They migrate across domains: religious, political, corporate, technological. Wherever systems promise total explanation, they create incentives to stop questioning premises and focus on execution. Wherever authority reframes obedience as insight, judgment becomes optional. The echo is subtle. It doesn't sound like fanaticism, it sounds like efficiency, like alignment, like shared language that eliminates friction, like frameworks that promise to absorb uncertainty so individuals don't have to carry it alone. And one illusion persists across every variation of this pattern: that intelligence provides immunity, that education inoculates against capture. Aum demonstrated something closer to the opposite. Intelligence can accelerate belief when belief is structured to reward it. Technical competence doesn't automatically resist manipulation. Sometimes it optimizes it, especially when paired with absolute purpose. And there is no obvious line where participation becomes complicity. That's what makes the pattern durable. The transition is gradual, and it is internally justified at every step. Each decision is smaller than the last one that made it possible. So the question that remains isn't only historical, it's structural. How much certainty should any system be allowed to provide before it begins to think on behalf of the people inside it? There isn't a definitive line to draw, only a recurring silence. That moment when asking why feels less responsible than asking what's next. And if you listen closely, that silence doesn't belong to one group in one era. It belongs to a human tendency to trade the burden of judgment for the comfort of coherence, to call it clarity, to call it progress, and not notice until much later that the most valuable thing you gave away was your ability to decide what things mean.